So I have a series of papers, and I'm happy to send you the ones that are finished, but part of it is we're still in the process, and so the chance to give this talk for me is great because I hope to come away with new ideas or contradictions to what I was saying. And so with that in mind, let me begin and try and tell you just one more kind of prelude. The way this started was that I was working with some students on, I worked on housing a lot, and so working in sub-Saharan Africa, I started focusing in particular on sanitation issues and the way an organization called Slum Dwellers International addresses those issues. And then I got into issues of how it's been measured in the social development goals, and then I thought I'd spend a few days looking at the history of what took place in the 19th century. Well, there's fascinating histories of what went on, and it's mostly of the cities, and then you have to kind of ferret out the part that focuses on how they addressed sanitation issues. But then that became something of it took, as Kate said, probably 9 months rather than a few days. And so then I circled back to try to think, how do these fit into the issues relating to sub-Saharan Africa? So that is kind of something of the journey that I've been on, but to relieve some of the anxieties perhaps, I of course recognize it's not a prequel at all. They're very different stories, but nevertheless I think there can be some insights from it, and that's what I'd like to pose today and get your reaction to. So without further ado, let me start. So why examine them? So one thing is that it was an innovation that was kind of extraordinary in terms of you had cholera epidemics that were frightening people to death. It was kind of Ebola times 10. You know, when London would have a cholera epidemic, historians suggest that up to 1/3 of the population of New York City would leave because they knew it was coming on the boats. And so it was terrifying, and it was a death that was not like the death today from infant mortality related to bad sanitation, which goes on secularly. This was intense and dramatic and quite scary. And so besides that, you also had the sense that the privies and so forth were becoming flooded, particularly in cities that had water supply, so the privies were flooding the cities, and so something had to be done, and there was a recognition and a lack of understanding of the disease vectors. So there was a whole sense of something has to be done in this area, what is it? And so that's one of the things that strikes us. It was the financing of something that costs more than most cities' annual budget. How do you finance that? And so one of the conjectures that I come up with is kind of the idea of just as the industrialization came off these various inventions, these same inventions allowed cities to become places where moving to them wasn't just deadly. In Manchester in the 19th century, for example, the average life expectancy at birth was 27 years, as opposed to the countryside where it was over 50. So you had a particular death premium by moving to cities, but people kept moving because the wages were there, even if it was killing them. So the question is, that came to mind was there's a political scientist named Charles Tilley who's worked on another large, expensive investment that changed the technology of providing wars. And his argument is that the technology was so expensive that the way you financed it mattered in terms of how nation states developed in Europe. And so his aphorism is, states make war, but wars make states. So the fact that you created treasuries, different types of mercantile exchanges, different types of budgeting, so forth, that set up an apparatus, a professionalization of government, which led to the creation of the nation states, particularly in Europe. So there's been a lot of work that suggests that empirically, when you refine that, there's lots of other issues, but nevertheless, it was an insight that can explain the map of Europe in some sense. So can you apply that aphorism to cities? Can you say that it's the high cost of the technology, again, the sewer investments exceeded an annual budget, was such that it created, if you financed it, and if you did or didn't finance it, how did that affect the city's development? So it's the question of, is it the financing rather than the cost of the technology, of a particularly expensive technology? And then if it was the financing, then how you financed it matters a great deal. And so then this gets into a debate, a policy question of whether it was financed by the participants, the direct beneficiaries, or whether it was financed by someone outside the direct participants, in general the central government. And so the debate, some of the bank people, and Dale Whittington, who's done an awful lot on sanitation, suggests that it should be self-financing. That in fact, in the US, they weren't provided until the 70s when you had the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Act, and so that self-financing is the way to go. Whereas a number of historians, and a fellow named Simon Schweitzer at Cambridge, says that that's absolutely untrue. So one of the questions is, who's right historically? Well, who has the evidence on that? And so besides that issue, there's also what Douglas North and I think it's John Wallace at Maryland suggests, that you have something called institutional transformation. So if you get financing sewers changing from something where you have individuals making decisions about use of a privity and a city basically controlling nuisances, to a city moving to say, we have to finance this whole system for a city, you change the way a city works. It's an institutional transformation. And if you look at a lot of the literature in terms of, and some of your own literature about how cities are so important for growth, you need that kind of institutional transformation for cities to become places that are locuses of agglomeration economies. And so finally, if you look at the evidence in terms of the 19th century, you see a rapid expansion in the share of GDP that's spent by local governments. This was part of this transformation. They set up mechanisms to get the resources and to finance those resources. So again, this is kind of the idea here, is what was the experience of the cities, the largest cities at the end of the 19th century, and that's New York, Chicago, Paris, London, Hamburg. Hamburg's not one of them, Berlin, but Hamburg was the first to install a system, and so it's kind of idiosyncratically kind of fun. So then I'm going to do the first part just in terms of the finance rather quickly, and I'm happy to give you a paper that I have on that, but what I want to dwell on, if I could, is the second part, and that's the effects of the financing. So show some of the effects and try to answer the historical question. So here's the three different approaches. And so the first two cities are London and Paris. And there the central government unambiguously said, we're going to do it. We're going to finance this. In London, the government said, we'll do a bunch of different tricks, but it was kind of lightweight and kind of taking a contingent liability in very careful ways. Whereas in Paris, it was Haussmann and Napoleon III. And they said, we're taking over the city. And it was, as Schweitzer says in one argument, it was a very Bonapartist view of how a government should work, an elitist sense of we're going to take control here and do this. It makes Paris one of the greatest cities in the world. Whereas in London, where if you read through the Houses of Parliament discussion, they already thought they were the greatest city, not only in the world, but of all time. And they wanted to maintain that position. So then the last one is what I would call windfall finance. A lot of this literature talks about taxless finance, which a lot of the canals in the US were financed with the government taking a contingent obligation. If they failed and the government bore the cost. And so a lot of the state constitutions prohibit that kind of finance. Well, windfall finance is an alternative. And in Germany, we had two very unique events historically, but it's not only the unique historical events. One is the city burnt down, and the other is the Franco-Prussian War, but it's the things that followed those that made the finance available. There's 6 cities, and there's lots of detail, and I don't want to dwell on it a lot, but I had a graduate student do some pretty images of the different cities, so I'll kind of quickly go through this. And so London the Thames was so bad that it was referred to as the Big Stink. And this was, I think, 1859. And so what you had was the central government's main vehicle, the parliament, being polluted by the city's malfunctioning. And so the central government came in and said, we're going to take charge of this, we're going to put some finance in here, and we're going to earmark a tax that we're going to control. In terms of a public finance perspective, this was what's the market imperfection, how do you address it? It's a first-generation fiscal finance approach. Paris, on the other hand, central government drove everything. It was the sense of, again, make this one of the important cities of the world, and part of that, and particularly Haussmann, wanted to do sewer systems, and he expanded them much more rapidly than he did his famous boulevards. And it became a spectacle. This was one of the great tours, to go to Paris's sewers. And again, they used contingent liabilities. They used a lot of condemnation practices. And again, the paper goes through the details of this, and it's kind of too rich for this discussion, but again, I'll send you the paper if you like. And then finally, we switched to the New World. And here you didn't have top-down finance at all. You had Chicago and New York. And both places, in a sense, if you look at New York, it was Boss Tweed, and he essentially seduced money out of a pliant financial system. He set up 5 banks, which financed sewers that ran to property that he owned, so that he capitalized the value of the sewers and made a lot of money on it. And so, and then the question is, how does New York function if they financed all this sanitation? Why didn't it default? Well, for Boss Tweed, fortuitously, they had a depression and interest rates were cut in half and they refinanced the debt. There's lots of other stories on that, but that was a large part of why New York, which went through Boss Tweed's extraordinary expansion of debt and came out of it without a bankruptcy. Chicago, on the other hand, waited until there was either state or central government assistance, but again, it was not the direct beneficiaries who got the funding. This is just a very quick image of Chicago, and the chart on the left, if you see the arrow that's pointing to the right-hand side, that's the Chicago River was running into Lake Michigan. Well, the city was also taking its water from there. So what they wanted to do was reverse, and what they did indeed do was reverse the river. So making the water go from Lake Michigan all the way over to the Mississippi. They lowered the depth of the Great Lakes by 3 or 4 inches in doing this. But it was basically making the city flush the water away from their water supply and into the Mississippi. Well, the people in the Mississippi didn't like this, of course. So there's issues around that, and it gets kind of colorful, but you get a sense of the scale of what was going on. And indeed, to do this, they had to raise the city 4 feet. But they imposed the cost of doing that on the private sector. People had to pay to have their buildings raised. And it's an extraordinary thought, but essentially the city was built on a swamp, and you have to pick it up to put the sewers in to get the kind of flow to it. So New York, and this is from Thomas Nash, had a lot of, in fact, led a lot of the going against Tweed, but the sense of Tweed used banks to finance the sewers, and he had the Sisters of Charity moving their money around from bank to bank, and finally they collapsed, but not until after he had financed the sewers to the property he owned. So this is the interest rate story that shows how, in some ways, the financing, the extraordinary rates of expansion of the financing could be paid for because the borrowing went where it was going up, and then it fell. And there in the, which one? The 1861, that middle chart there, middle dip. So now we're to go to Germany, which in many ways is the most idiosyncratically interesting of all. You had in Hamburg, they had a fire that burnt the city down and destroyed something like 30,000 homes. They also couldn't get the water pressure up because the sewer system wasn't, the water system wasn't sufficient pressure. Berlin, there were 25 states in what was pre-Germany. They had the Franco-Prussian War, they defeated France, and they made the French pay reparations of 22% of GDP, which the French paid off very quickly. With those funds, they consolidated those 25 states into Germany, and they built the capital of what was the Imperial Germany, which was again another, this is going to be one of the greatest cities in the world, but which at that time was a backward place. Edwin Chadwick, he's a famous sanitarian, said, you can identify someone from Berlin by the smell of their clothing. And so there was lots of sarcasm about where Berlin was. Once they had these reparations, they could finally invest in the city and the sewer system as well. So again, you have very idiosyncratic, and in Hamburg, after they had the London fire of 1677, they set up an insurance company. Everybody had to pay homeowners insurance. So they had an enormous payout of insurance at which they could use to rebuild the city. They rebuilt the city in brick, and they put it in sewer and water supply. So it was not only the events, the war and the fire, but it was, in fact, you had an insurance payout and you had extraordinary reparations that were paid. It fundamentally changed the cities. This is not a very clear image, but they had a party with the Prince of Wales above the sewer system when they opened it up in London. And it changed from Dickens to the Prince of Wales having a party above the sewer system, and they had architectural beauties in terms of the pumping stations and so forth. so this kind of reviews what happened in the various cities. And again, I refer you to the paper on the details of that and want to move to the other side. But so the question is, how about cities today? The photo on the left is Paris in the 19th century before the sewers were installed. It looks a lot like Cabrera today in many respects. And this is Paris, you all know this image on the right. So how do you move from that image on the left to perhaps not the image on the right, but something different that has sanitation and health provision? And this is Bamako, and it's the photo on the left is one by a German airplane pilot about 1910, and the one on the right is more recent. And again, you see the roads there's a little bit more chaos, but not too much difference in terms of the way the city looks. So again, I would argue that the cities underwent an institutional transformation. You had to set up resource mobilization, you had to set up urban planners, you had to get tax assessments, you had to do different mechanisms so the central government could fund these institutions. And so rather than individuals making decisions and the city being in charge of nuisances, you had the city taking control of resources and providing public goods that mattered. So how did it affect health? So this is the time zero refers to different dates. It's the time each city installed its sewage system. And so that varies. Hamburg is 1842. Berlin is like 1872. Again, the exact dates are in the paper, but what I'm talking about here is to give you a sense of after the sanitation systems are installed, what happened to, in this case, one is the deaths per thousand. I have two different charts. One is infant mortality and one is deaths per thousand, because there aren't a lot of comparable data. And what you see is Hamburg went off the chart. You still had death rates going up. Well, if they were calling themselves the cleanest city in Europe, what happened? Whereas the other two, you have kind of a secular, slow decline with some bumps, both in Chicago and Berlin. And Berlin in particular did very well. Chicago, again, you're on the swamp and you have different incidences. And there's lots of other things going on. And so kind of part of the storyline here is, of course, there are lots of other things. And this is not a monocausal story. But there is unambiguous evidence that indeed this matters a lot. And now there's well-identified models that show that this is a driving factor. Just changing the way milk was provided was an important factor. But unambiguously, the provision of sanitation mattered in all these places. So this is a different one in terms of, again, there's one outlier, and it's Paris. After it's installed, it just kept climbing up. Whereas the other two cities, we had a decline. And particularly after water filtration came in. And this is later in the 19th century. So it's not just the sanitation systems themselves, but the pipes and so forth. It's how is that water treated. Now, in both the outliers, there's circumstances that explain what happened. In Hamburg, they really didn't provide a citywide system. They didn't include the poor. And the poor would put their waste in the canals. They didn't have a filtration system. So there was a city right next to it, Altona, which was governed by the Prussians as opposed to the city-state of Hamburg. They had 8 deaths from cholera. Hamburg had 8,000. So both, the rate of coverage for the poor was just not done in Hamburg. And so while they were saying it was the cleanest city in Europe, indeed it was not. In fact, they had not covered the whole city. And so its experience is not, it's consistent with that kind of result. The same with Paris. Paris, Haussmann was particularly interested in storm drainage. So most of his sewers were for storm drainage rather than waste. And so in the 1880s, they also had a big stink, as they had in London 20 years earlier. And finally, they started connecting the sewer systems and so forth. So again, it's idiosyncratic. So the results are what you would expect. And so you get a sense of the history plays out in terms of the numbers as well. So the health experience. So they didn't work out nearly as well as expected right away. And it took 30 and 40 years for the results to really take hold. In Paris, it wasn't until the 20s that you had the system really connected throughout the country. And that's almost 72 generations later. So it gets to the question of putting citywide sewer systems in takes some time. And to accrue and realize the health benefits, it's not going to happen quickly. So this is Schweitzer's story. And his story, it's kind of careful history, and it's a sense of everywhere that this was done, in fact, you had the central government or some resources from outside the city. Now, Tweed is a very unusual case in which it was just manipulating a regulator who didn't understand what was going on. But in any event, it was not that the direct beneficiaries who were the financiers. In no case of the 19th century, large cities, and these were the biggest cities in the world at that time, were they self-financed. But it was more than just the finance that matters. The finance is extremely important, and who paid for it, but you also had to have a control of what was the fact that was generating the pollution. And so even where subsidies were given, they were not enough. You had to control the source. You had to connect buildings to sanitation and so forth. So is it a prequel? Well, obviously not. I mean, the 19th century, these cities, just the size of these cities, we're talking about near 1 million people, whereas in African cities today, you're talking 5 and 10 million. It's a very different context. So what I do now is try to unbundle some of the differences, and this is what Josephina and I are working on now. So just to give one sense of things, if you look at per capita investments, and the initial study are the cities that we had are these 6 cities, and this is, I think it's 2010 prices, income? 1990, okay. This is from the Madison project, and trying to get comparable figures in terms of the income of sub-Saharan African countries and the countries when they installed their systems. Now, part of what we're doing is we're doing more cities, and so we now have something like 15 cities, and even though most of the other cities put the systems in later, the per capita incomes are getting closer. And indeed, there's a funny distribution in sub-Saharan Africa. And the funny distribution is really kind of a tragic distribution. What you see is, on the left-hand side, is there's an awful lot of really poor countries. So the mean for those countries is quite different. And so we're doing some transformations of the data to look at it in terms of which countries are, if we did get it in terms of essential tendency, essential mean tendency, what does it look like? And so that's part of what we're doing now. But you can see sub-Saharan Africa, you've got a lot of really poor countries. I think it's 27 out of the 31 lowest income countries in the world. So on this one, this is the date of when they implemented it. What we did was we took the per capita income, and then we got data on what was the difference between incomes in the per capita in that city relative to the country. So these are approximations. Like in Chicago, for example, you have a Midwest region, which understates Chicago, but it's higher than the national figure. So this one, we didn't do that adjustment. We're at an early stage of it, but it gives you a sense of the different range of the countries, and you can see what the income levels are. And you go back to the sub-Saharan, and they're considerably lower. So the point I'm getting at here is, if you have an investment that exceeds the budget, you have to pay for it. And if your per capita income is a lot lower, that's harder to do. So what we show in one of the papers is that Paris had debt. Paris's income was 15% below London's and considerably below New York's, but they had more debt than either of those places. And so Haussmann was pushing a lot of debt out to remodel the city. Now we've been looking at governance levels. And governance levels, as you can imagine, are pretty attenuated from what was going on in the cities. But what we do have is something called Polity 4. Some of you may know this data. It goes back to 1820, I think it is, and it's on a national level. We have some local government level data for sub-Saharan Africa, but just for comparability, we've looked at what happens in terms of the governance levels in the countries when they installed systems, as opposed to 2 groupings of sub-Saharan Africa, the ones in the left end of the tail and the others. And what it turns out is the ones in the left end of the tail have better governance than did the early reformers. So on a governance level, in principle, they should be able to do this. They should be able to manage citywide systems. And this gives you some sense of this, and forget the kind of what we're measuring, but it's the scale that matters. And the top half of the income distribution in sub-Saharan Africa, and moving to the right, you have better governance. The bottom is the lower end of the distribution. So we split it in half, we split them up, and you see that, in fact, the lower income have better governance, according to Polity 4, than the top end. And so to me, this is a curiosity, because I've gone back to some of the human development indicators for the lowest income countries, and many of those countries have not moved in 75 years. So the poverty there is substantial and durable. And so you would think with decent governance measures, and so this is something we want to look at a lot more. And so, but it was a surprise to us in going through it. On the other side, the optimistic side, if it's valid, it suggests that they have the capability on a governance level to install such systems, as complicated as they are. So most OECD countries are in the top, in the right-hand side, 8s to 10s. The average for sub-Saharan Africa was 2, something like that. So it gives you, again, it's some disinterested measure, and it has kind of, if you look at the qualities, you'd say, they seem to make sense to me. I might add one or take one away, but it's some way of trying to say, what are their governance capabilities, and how do they compare? So, for example, Paris, when the emperor was there, was an autocracy, whereas England had moved into an anocracy 25 years earlier, and it was kind of run, an anocracy is a place run by elites. It's not a full democracy by any standard, but it's moving in that direction. So in some of this, I've gone through the health threat, and to consider the motivation for undertaking investments in sanitation. And earlier I talked about cholera and the sense of the threat that posed. And if you think of Ebola and multiply it by 10, and the deaths were extraordinary. Seeing people die was quite vivid. So now you have a sense that they understand the disease vectors, and they know you can concentrate the disease. You can concentrate the illnesses, particularly in low-lying areas of cities that are slum areas. So there isn't this terror that it's the whole city that's affected. So people in the whole city have much less motivation to invest in citywide systems, or indeed even in the systems in slums. That's localized and it's concentrated. So the disease vectors and the motivation for responding are quite different today than they were. And so a lot of the literature on what motivated the investments was that it was private industrialists wanted the water supply and sanitation systems, particularly the water supply, to run their industries, weaving and so forth, and textiles. But once you get the water put in, that floods the system, and then you almost have to put in a sanitation system. You can also talk about there's less water availability. New York had Croton Reservoir, and that able to do that made it very attractive to other places around there to kind of bundle into it. And it was one of the motivators for Brooklyn, in fact, to be annexed by New York. Sub-Saharan Africa, many cities do not have that, and so the costs of providing this increase a lot. In addition, there's a recognition today that if you just throw the waste down the river, that's just moving the problem as Chicago did for many years. So the sense back then in many places was the cost that you didn't have to do treatment. You just had to put in the sanitation, the pipes and the pumping stations. Now it's realized that is just shifting your cost. And so you have to put in treatment facilities as well, so it's more expensive. So again, there's so many differences that even it's a bit of an ironic joke to say it's a prequel, but nevertheless there are some insights, I think, or some perspective. Even though infant mortality is much lower today than it was, in fact it's half what it was in these cities when they installed systems, so you can see the sense of urgency is much reduced. But on the other hand, if you look at the gap between the infant mortality rate for sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, it's 20 times larger in sub-Saharan Africa. And so while sub-Saharan Africa has the infant mortality, the decline has followed all kinds of innovations in medicines and supplies and facilities of medical services. It's followed that down with a lag, the declining infant mortality, but the gap persists, and it's an enormous gap. And I would venture to speculate that citywide sanitation plays a big role in that, particularly when you go through the econometrics of the important role that it's played throughout history. And then this comes to the next part of the story, is the urban growth rates when this was going on. Again, you had, the death rates were so high, the only way these cities grew was because the growth rates were pretty high in terms of migration. Well, in Africa today, over the next 15 years, 25 years, they're going to add 400 million people. This is a kind of conservative expectation of what's going to go on. And if you look at what the conditions are now, 40% of people in sub-Saharan African cities have access to improved sanitation. And that's a figure that's essentially unchanged despite the last 15 years, which has been an extraordinarily high growth rate of per capita income. So in terms of affordability, They have much greater affordability, but there hasn't been much of a supply response. The African Development Bank, Habitat, almost all the observers suggest that most African cities, most of the population lives in slums now. So they're in a bad state now, coming out of high growth and going into an extraordinary demographic shift. Very few countries have a debt market, a bond market, where you can finance investments like this. All of the 6 cities, the 5 largest in particular, had active bond markets by the time they were financed. So you could use a long-term finance to amortize it. If you can amortize a loan over 30 years, the cost of that declined precipitously, and if you already have higher income, between those 2 factors, you have a very different quality of demand for goods. The policy implications. And so, number 1, the current institutional structures, and this goes back to my conjecture or speculation that you've had an institutional transformation in these cities in the 19th century. The current institutions can't do it in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of them mobilize very little in the way of resources. There's no way to access finance, at least domestic finance. So what do? So, you know, in terms of thinking about it, if you go back to some of those charts about how long it takes a generation after you put it in a citywide system. So there's not a quick response. It takes quite a while to put in a system, even if you have good governance. If you talk to the World Bank has a new study of Africa, and their argument is you shouldn't do anything until you establish property rights. Well, almost every African country has been considering what to do with property rights since independence. So I would argue that you're not going to get that for a generation or more either. And their argument is you shouldn't be doing anything until they get property rights established. Well, both sewers and property rights, what do you do in the next generation while these 400 million people are coming to cities that are already, majority of the people live in slums? And this is where I would argue what happens to health in the meantime, and what do you do? And so instead of thinking of citywide sanitation, which is a collective good, kind of almost a pure public good on the scale of the city, and how do you get people to pay for it, you're talking about optimal group size, which is trying to ration numbers of people into a group and manage the group. And so organizations like Slum Dwellers International, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, they do this, and they do it in ways that are almost like a franchising mechanism. I was in Ghana and talked to them about how do they get people together to mobilize around providing sanitation. I said, this is the same thing they do in India. And they said, well, it's not a surprise because we read their handbook. So in a sense, what they've done is show that, and they're now in 34 countries, that you can almost franchise delivery mechanisms. But the point is, you have to realize that these are a fiscal delivery mechanism and not just the democratic institutional capability. It's something much more than that, and it's in terms of addressing problems, it's one that I think is very important. But finally, they're not able to finance this. This is something that's expensive in terms of the income levels, in terms of how do you target the poorest people who are living in slums. It needs carefully targeted subsidies. It's not just something that you can say, oh, let's rely on micro-enterprise finance or the banking system. It's not going to do it. In terms of the numbers coming, the level of services that now exist, there has to be a sense of, and in terms of if you think of the way that multilaterals behave, in some sense they've functioned as debt markets for countries that don't have them. So if you could talk about IDA funds, targeted in terms of cities, in terms of addressing the sanitation question, you know, there's lots of other, there's property rights, there's electricity, there's the climate change, there's a whole range of priorities, but this should be one of them. And I don't think that this is one that's really being discussed a lot in terms of policy dimension. So again, I come back to the idea that this is something that community groups are a lot more than just lefty organizations that give you democratic cognizance. There's something that in terms of if you want to address a problem that's going to have enormous health effects, and I would argue enormous institutional capability effects, this is a way to go from the bottom up to build it, rather than working with local governments that are controlling and rationing those resources. And also, I think the role for international institutions is an increasingly important one, and one that I don't see when I read through the African Development Bank or Habitat or the World Bank for that matter, sufficient emphasis on this as a looming problem that has lots of institutional concerns. With that, thank you.